The first time I ever heard of the Boeing uninterruptible autopilot was in the conversations between you and the other members of Able Danger. Of course, you've done quite a lot to raise awareness about this, and now we've had all these Boeing accidents. How are you today, David?
I'm very well, Jason. Good to be with you.
Good to see you as always. We've got a very interesting episode today. There was this Ethiopian Air crash of the Boeing 737 MAX 8, one of Boeing's newest, most sophisticated, and most popular commercial jets. What do we know about this so far, David, and how does it play into all the stuff you and I have been talking about with the Federal Bridge and all that?
Well, it looks to me like it's a hack of Boeing. Of course, you've got this extraordinary Federal Bridge Certification Authority in which I believe Mr. David G. Swigert is an expert, and he's been selling his services as an ethical hacker to various clients. I don't know who all his clients are. I know that one, but then he says he was actually in 1992, was Booz Allen and Hamilton, and he was working with them on classified networks. Well, that's very worrying in the context of the crashes of this Boeing 737 MAX 8, because Booz Allen and Hamilton stages these top-off continuity of government exercises, where top officials are trained and rehearsed by or groomed to respond to events which are actually imputed into government networks. So on 911, there was a continuity of government exercise, presumably or involving Booz Allen and Hamilton, and the classified networks that were actually being engaged to defend America against an attack. And unfortunately for Mr. Swigert, he may, well, if I make the best interpretation of him, he could be an ethical hacker or believes he's an ethical hacker, but he may not be a very good ethical hacker. So he goes in, opens a door or a link between EADS, the manufacturer of Airbus, and Boeing, and allows people behind EADS, the manufacturers of Airbus, to hack into Boeing aircraft on 911 and trigger a double occurrence event, which would be defined as both towers coming down in the same day.
David, let me interrupt for just a moment, because I think we need to be very cautious how we pose our speculative argument here. It's not to say that we presume that EADS or anyone involved directly with EADS or Airbus did this. We're simply looking at the technology of this federal bridge, and we're saying, if someone were able to hack this, would they be able to initiate these things? Because, you know, David, it doesn't need to be anyone who's involved in any of these companies. These are publicly traded companies, and all we need to do is get a quote for Boeing this morning: the stock continues to slide. So someone who has no direct involvement with Boeing or EADS or any of the companies on the Federal Bridge could be interested in initiating some sort of a hack to drive the stock price down, and then, you know, doing some sort of buying and selling puts, shorting the stock. There's all kinds of ways people can make money if they know there's going to be some dramatic shift in the stock price. And this goes back to the cat bond theories that you've been sharing with us, this relatively new financial instrument, the catastrophe bond. What we're exploring are the circumstances that could allow someone perhaps to hire an ethical hacker and then not tell that ethical hacker that they're hiring also an unethical hacker, potentially to penetrate one of these systems and cause any sort of havoc. It was interesting to note, David, President Trump was tweeting yesterday that airplanes are becoming far too complex. Could this be some sort of tongue-in-cheek message, some sort of, I use this term broadly, but coded message that perhaps Donald Trump is aware that these flight systems are so interconnected to these classified networks that nefarious people could potentially do these sort of things?
Well, absolutely. And President Trump is ill-served by his Commerce Secretary, Wilbur Ross, who you interviewed on these issues. And Wilbur Ross didn't appear to know that SERCO had processed the 4 millionth patent for the United States Patent and Trademark Office. He said that the Patent Office is a self-contained entity within government. Well, of course, it's not. And so SERCO is the de facto custodian of the kinds of technologies that would make the Federal Bridge and its twin network, which is the Northwestern University IT Partnership Network, extraordinarily vulnerable to a man-in-the-middle attack. You could actually attack Northwestern University's IT partnerships from the Federal Bridge, or vice versa, through the state of Illinois, because it sits on both networks. But back to the cat bond.
But wait, let me stop you there, David, because that's a critical component of your theories here. Because I didn't get this until sort of just the other day. The Federal Bridge is, there are these wide area networks and local area networks. So if the Federal Bridge is some sort of self-contained network with this public-private key infrastructure, it's conceivably protected from people who are just generally on the internet getting to it. But if I understand what you're saying correctly, because the state of Illinois is connected to the Federal Bridge, and also because the state of Illinois is part of this other potentially private network, which is the Northwestern University Information Technology Partnerships, through these two networks, they can interconnect between all of the different components. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, totally. So, if you wanted to launch a man-in-the-middle attack, presumably you would choose the most corrupt state in the Union, right? Which is the state of Illinois. And even worse, the most corrupt city in America is Chicago. So you put those two together, and I think if you go up the top there, you've got, I think Chicago is there. So you've got this extraordinary opportunity if there are a bunch of ethical hackers bumbling around doing what they think is ethical. As you point out, an unethical hacker can come in behind and basically launch a man-in-the-middle attack and trigger a major stock exchange event, like a drop in Boeing shares, and all you need to do is short the shares. But coming back to the cat bond, this is where the real dirty money is cleaned and the big money is made. And let me just go through a cat bond that might be set up for what has been loosely described as a double occurrence. So with a cat bond, you have a sponsor and you have an investor. And I think very often in this case, the investor is the big, dumb private pension fund of the teachers, TIAA, Teachers Insurance Annuity Association, which is the largest private pension fund in the world. And it happens to be a shareholder in SERCO. And SERCO met on the 47th floor of the North Tower, 911. Its flip side in the United Kingdom is called the University Superannuation Scheme, and that's about £50 billion. So they're both very substantial funds. And as shareholders of SERCO, they're the only funds that are owned by the people who might lose money, as opposed to the banks, the custodians of the banks, because they're playing with other people's money. So the two big teachers' pension funds, I think they're just set up perfectly for a cat bond fraud, where if you get sometimes I call them rogue teachers, or sometimes, as you know, I call them evil teachers. That is to say, they're people who have access to the electronic visualization laboratory at the University of Illinois in Chicago. Those two networks have the greatest potential for propagating propaganda and entertainment and news in the world, because the vehicle by which they do that is the BBC. And I'm thinking of Dr. Thomas Barnett's words describing the events at the North Tower, presumably vacated by SERCO shareholders, because no one died there, the first live broadcast mass snuff film in human history. On those two networks, that is to say, Northwestern University's IT partnerships and the Federal Bridge Certification Authority, the only entity that could put together the first live broadcast mass snuff film in human history is the British Broadcasting Society, Corporation. So going back to the cat bonds, you have a sponsor on one side who stands to lose all their money if the catastrophe doesn't happen. You have the investor that puts up a lot more money than the sponsor, and they stand to lose all of their money if the catastrophe does happen. And then you have a law firm that handles the escrow services on behalf of the two parties, the sponsor and the investor. And it turns out the law firm in Chicago that does that, specializes, has a world-leading position in catastrophe bonds, is Sidley Austin. So then I'm reminded, well, Sidley Austin employed Bernadine Dawn in 1984. In what capacity, I don't know, other that she would have been in an excellent position, and she's the leader of the Weather Underground terrorist organization sworn to overthrow America with her husband, Bill Ayers. She was in an excellent position to groom Barack Hussein Obama and Michelle Obama in the art of catastrophe bonds, if you will.
It turns just astounding, David, that these people are being hired by law firms and universities rather than being stuck in prison for bombing and trying to subvert the United States, isn't it?
Yeah, these two are sociopaths, you see, and sometimes I wonder about psychopaths, but if psychopaths, he's got to have someone beating up someone else. But this woman does actually do a seminar at Northwestern University on torture paradigms and practice. So I presume she would be expert at scripting the case, but, you know, I digress. In January of 2000, she, apparently you can do this, she joined the faculty of University of Illinois in Chicago with her husband, Bill Ayers. So at the University of Illinois, Chicago, she would have had access to the electronic visualization laboratory to help stage, let's say, the first live broadcast mass snuff film in human history. And so the teachers that come along, the next generation, if you will, and that's the Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton out of the University of Arkansas. And then the next generation after that, out of the University of Chicago, is Barack Hussein and Michelle Obama. Now, so there you have 6 teachers, I believe, more or less committed to the overthrow of the government of the United States through attacks such as the bombing of the East African embassies in 1998, the bombing of the USS Cole in Aden Harbor in 2000, and I'll just come back to that, and then the attacks of 9/11 and subsequent attacks on these aircraft through the Federal Bridge.
Let's pause for a second, David, before you carry on, because I want to point out a few things. This article here from the Chicago Tribune, this is from November 4th, 2001, literally just days, a couple weeks after September 11th, and it's saying that ex-radicals on faculty rile alumni and professors. Timing once saved their lives, but lately it's worked against Bernadine Dawn and Bill Ayers, one-time leaders of the nation's most notorious Vietnam-era radical protest group, have found their violent pasts thrown into a harsher, more critical light in the wake of September 11th attacks. So, I mean, here it is that they're being scrutinized right after September 11th by teachers and alumni there at the university, and it's being spoken about. Certainly the Chicago Tribune is mainstream media. I also wanted to point out to you, David, this is a little bit off topic, but you were speaking about BBC. This Riam Dalati is a producer apparently at BBC and has put out this tweet just a few days ago where he says, after almost 6 months of investigations, I can prove without a doubt that the Duma hospital scene was staged. No fatalities occurred in the hospital. All the white helmet activists and people I spoke to are either Idlib or Euphrates Shield, either in those two areas. Only one person was in Damascus. So this guy is coming out and saying that the chemical attack footage was staged.
Well, that's right. So once you have that electronic visualization laboratory, and you can Google some of the artwork produced there, and I'll come back to why it's so vital that these facilities are available to students to ground truth their teachers, and I can come back to that because it's a kind of technical assessment. But the artwork produced through the electronic visualization laboratory at the University of Illinois, Chicago, includes battlefield torture, climate change, and immersive narratives. And what that means essentially is someone like Bernadine Dawn and Bill Ayers can write a script for what they would like to happen on 9/11, and that could be injected through the Electronic Visualization Laboratory and its IT partnerships around the world as a theory of what might happen if big, bad, nasty, satanic America doesn't do what it's told and basically fold its tent and walk away. So that gets projected into the mainstream media through a partner of the Northwestern University IT partnerships, and the only media partner, which is the British Broadcasting Corporation. And as you know, there's this famous scene with Jane Stanley in New York. She's reporting about the collapse of the Salomon Smith Barney building, and it's still standing over her left shoulder, right? And the Salomon Smith Barney building is the place where I believe all of the evidence of the conspiracy to bring both towers down in the same day and trigger a cat bond would have been basically obliterated and then shoveled away by this company, AMIC. So the idea of setting up a cat bond for sociopathic teachers, and I think the average member of the faculty, because I think in that article you just showed, you talked about the alumni, which are the students that go to these universities.
Right.
And of course, there's a clear distinction between the students who go to a university to learn and the teachers who tell them what they want to teach, right?
Well, it's
so
both,
you get these
alumni and professors.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's both. So this comes back to my theory that what you and I can be doing or are doing effectively is alerting the decent, whatever that means, teachers that are teaching at these post-secondary institutions and universities of it's in their own interest. If their pension fund is being ripped off, and remember this is the biggest private pension fund, in serial ongoing double catastrophe bond frauds, it's in their interest to work with the students to ground truth the theory. Like if the theory that is propagated through the evil Batcave is that American soldiers and military people are going into battle and they're being groomed to torture the citizens they're there to protect. And so there's a perception when they come back, and that was true of Vietnam, that these people are just animals who've been tortured, the local population they're trying to save. You got an extraordinary propaganda machine that's extremely difficult to fight because now people look at the military askance, that they think that they're all torturing animals. So to give the students the facility to ground test the theory of the teachers, I think is absolutely vital. And the only way, I believe, to fight this incredible machine, I've always said that the BBC is the world's premier propaganda, entertainment, and news, and it has been so since 1924 or so. So when you run into World War I or Pearl Harbor or World War II, you've always got to be looking at the BBC's ability to manipulate perceptions over to you.
David, it's interesting for me to see how many trolls come to these broadcasts and try to stop us from discussing this. It doesn't seem like really the most productive use of time, but really it's an indicator, David, that someone is very deliberately trying to stop people from looking at what we're discussing here, and they make these vague sort of false statements without directly challenging what we're saying or even interpreting what we're saying accurately. This is really the main reason why you and I have created our weekly broadcasts on patreon.com. And for people who enjoy the questions that you and I are asking and the lines of speculation that we open, the lines of investigation that we open, people should really go to patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and sponsor David. I would also ask that people go to patreon.com/crowdsource the truth and become sponsors of Crowdsource the Truth. I've also created subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth because we've got these persistent trolls, David. They keep launching lawsuits, and they keep threatening that they're going to contact the companies that we talk about. But it's strange because it seems to me, David, there's a guy who broadcasts, or he used to at one point, broadcast a lot of stuff about Seth Rich. And he said something about Donna Brazil. And like the next day, Donna Brazil sent a cease and desist letter, brought a lawsuit. There's nothing stopping any of these companies that we're talking about from contacting us, from sending us a cease and desist letter if we've said anything, if we've put anything in an indelicate sort of phrasing, or if we've misstated anything. We are merely questioning the possibility that a supposedly secure network like the public-private key infrastructure of the Federal Bridge, could it be penetrated by hackers? And if it could, what are the implications of a network that includes the United Kingdom Ministry of Defense, the Netherlands Ministry of Defense, all these major U.S. Military industrial contractors, European military industrial contractors, non-federal intermediaries that at one point employed David Swigert, the most persistent detractor of this effort, a man who spreads false information so aggressively it's ridiculous to presume that he could spend his time doing anything else other than trying to hack our broadcasts with fake user accounts.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And if you could find that older version of the Federal Bridge, you'll see that there are two banks that were on the Federal Bridge. And then it gets updated, I guess, on a fairly regular basis. But the two banks are interesting in the context of the sociopathic teachers in the double occurrence when both towers came down on the same day and triggered, in my belief, a massive catastrophe bond fraud on the teachers, because those two banks were Citigroup and Wells Fargo. And it was Wells Fargo that provided the finance, a cartel of lenders that allowed Larry Silverstein to buy the 99-year mortgage on the Twin Towers from the Port Authority of New York or New Jersey, I think about 6 weeks to 2 months before the towers were collapsed or demolished. And that's very interesting because there had been a war game, the Amalgam Virgo war game of the 1st and 2nd of June of 2001, which simulated a hijacking of a Boeing 737, I think, over Alaska, flying south over Abbotsford, and then turning east to target the Capitol building in the United States. And that's dated the 1st and 2nd of June of 2001. In that same month, I think what happened is various dark forces, or let's call them sociopathic teachers in Chicago and on the Federal Bridge around the world, detected a vulnerability in America's ability to defend against such an attack led by Osama bin Laden, i.e. it was no surprise because 1st and 2nd of June, it was a full dress rehearsal of an attack on the United States. Presumably, if the Capitol building was the target, it was to overthrow the government of the United States because that's where the Congress and Senate, passed their laws. Anyway, the leverage lease appears to have been created by none other than our friend Barack Hussein Obama, because in 1984 he was working with BIC, and some people say that BIC stood for Business International Corporation, but I prefer to think it stands for British Invisibles Corporation, the big banks and insurance companies and pension funds that comprise, or appears to comprise, the bulk of the shareholders of SERCO that met on the 47th floor. So when Mr. Obama is working as what is either junior senator from Illinois, I think in 2001, he would be an expert on the structure of a leveraged lease for the Twin Towers that could have a catastrophe bond structured by the Sidley Austin law firm where he used to work, that if you sat on the right side of the bond, you could make a lot of money. And to sit on the right side of the bond, all you need is the sociopathic teachers, as I choose to describe them, and their personal investments or private funds or private foundations like the Clinton Foundation to be on the sponsor side of the bond that would make out in spades if both towers could be demolished on the same day and attributed to fire. And basically, the people who did that would escape justice. Over on the other side is the big dumb teachers pension fund, the largest private pension fund in the world, where the alumni and the faculty at these universities are blindly acceptant of the fact that they're going to get a monthly check when they retire, and they don't really care or don't choose to care where those investments are going. Well, maybe I could introduce them, maybe you could find that spot there is a patent that's been taken out for carbon credits and securities in a trust. And the idea of that patent, and I think it was taken out by the Cantor Fitzgerald people, the people who lost 680 people in the top of the North Tower, when Howard Lutnick, the inventor, was taking his child to school. That patent describes a procedure whereby a trust, an investment trust, can actually balance off the carbon spewing arms of its investments, which might be investees like Boeing, if they can buy carbon credits from a company that saves a certain weight of carbon. And one way of saving quite a lot of carbon, of course, is to crash a Boeing 737 MAX 8, because those two planes, the Ethiopian one and the Indonesian one, were practically brand new. So let's assume they have 30 years of life, spewing carbon dioxide, this filthy fertilizer gas that's transparent and odorless and exists in trace quantities around the world. You knock out one of those planes, you kill all of the people who would have had an average life expectancy, 40, 50 years, and you save a lot of carbon, and you can flog that carbon credit to the trust so that it can hold more shares in Boeing. So you've got a massive, massive racketeering influence and corrupt organization under SERCO, which is its shareholders, which include 3 countries, the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, and Singapore. Well, if I understand correctly, Saudi Arabia is supposed to have supplied the mussel hijackers from Al Qasim province that came through Dubai and picked up their visas from the then operator of the United States National Visa Center, which is SERCO. Over to you.
David, it's interesting, and I think it's worth repeating frequently that you and I have been exploring this carbon climate exchange, the Chicago Climate Exchange, and the whole concept of carbon credits as being an instrument that can be exchanged like a currency. Why is that able to ring? I know why. Sorry, David. Very sorry. It's not supposed to do that. But people try to interfere with our broadcasts here. Let me stop that from happening. It's very interesting that they've got this alternative currency that are, things are transacted in this Chicago Climate Exchange. It's doubly interesting that the niece of Richard Sandor, who created, along with Al Gore, that Chicago Climate Exchange, has become a regular troll of this program. I don't think that's a coincidence. It's worth further investigation. But of course, we don't necessarily suspect that this would be the only motivation for doing something like this. You and I have frequently discussed how these complex operations have redundancies in purpose, redundancies in all regards. I've been taking note of a lot of different reports about several UN staff members that were among the victims on the Ethiopian plane crash. Anytime these plane crashes occur, the nature of the crash and the aircraft and the impact on the company are often the headline events. But it's interesting to note who's on board these planes, and we've also often spoken about how a plane crash is the preferred method of exterminating some of these high-value targets, because just as we're seeing, it takes the majority of the attention away from the individuals on the plane and focuses on the crash itself. Now, I was watching Kip Simpson's YouTube channel earlier, and he had a very good report about, he was talking about how the State Department had warned U.S. citizens to not go to Addis Ababa airport before this happened. Had you heard about that?
No, I don't. But you see, that's consistent with a hack into the federal bridge and the probable link through the state of Illinois, the most corrupt state in the union, into Northwestern University's IT partnerships around the world, which links straight through to the BBC. So, for example, if you want to inject news or engage in a media play, you can let it out through the BBC, and immediately you've got a worldwide audience of 200 million people who are told, for example, on 911, that this is Osama bin Laden's, a total surprise. Bill Clinton and everyone else in the allegedly in the United States government were totally surprised with this. But I would point out they rehearsed the exercise on the 1st and 2nd of June with Amalgam Virgo with bin Laden's ugly mug on the front page and
Right.
a bunch of missiles around it, right? And I believe someone who's an expert in missile identification, what they were really saying is, can we get away with a missile attack on the United States on 9/11 that can be attributed to Osama bin Laden and his pilots who could barely fly Cessnas? And they rehearsed it on the 1st and 2nd of June. They discovered that America was at its most vulnerable at the end of each individual war game. So the red team is attacking the blue team with targets back in the 1st and 2nd of June, let's say, as the Capitol building. And when the red team gets within 3 minutes of target, maybe to drop off one of those missiles, the war game maestro, the supervisor, says, knock it off. And the blue team and the red team go home, and then over some beers, they do a lessons learned program to find out what the vulnerability of the blue team or what the vulnerability of the red team would be. And the blue team and the red team would never believe that that could be switched from a simulation exercise to a live fire exercise, as happened on 9/11. And the kind of person, and I'm not saying that he did the switch consciously, because I don't think he may think he's a smart, ethical hacker. I think he's dumb as a bag of hammers, because he's got this signature all around the internet about what he can do. So really smart people, like the late GCHQ spy Gareth Williams, who they found folded 3 ways into a bag in a apartment in Pimlico in the UK. A really smart hacker like that would be able to come in behind Dave Swigart and monitor the movements of these people, let's say the sociopathic teachers on either the Federal Bridge or Northwestern University's IT partnerships. And one sociopathic teacher, in my opinion, is Bill Clinton,
Right.
University of Arkansas.
Whose schedule had been viewed by the GCHQ hacker Gareth Williams.
Yes, and obviously, so Gareth Williams presumably went to his bosses in GCHQ or the Ministry of Defense and said, well, I know that Bill Clinton hops onto the Lolita Express on a regular basis, sometimes with his wife, but not always. And they go off on this, what I call the pedophile piloted pimping network run by Jeffrey Epstein on that island, which is supposedly burnt to the ground. So what these people are doing, they've got a Con Air, Department of Justice, pedophile piloted pimping network, where they take people to be serviced by the jockey boys in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, where I used to live.
They
or
could.
Take people. They could, yes. And they could take a Bill Clinton, either the president or former president of the United States, onto an island where the chalets are stuffed with cameras that record every movement, God forbid, of Bill Clinton or his wife, Hillary Clinton, and then those two are blackmailed.
Okay,
right?
so let me pause you, David, because you're covering a million things that I want to give some more detail on before we get too far away from them. So you're talking about the BBC injecting fake news, and what we've got is, I don't know that Nairobi news is necessarily mainstream media. Perhaps in Africa it is, or at least in Nairobi it is, but we don't know that. This is an article from Nairobi News talking about the US government having warned citizens to avoid the Ethiopian airport before the plane crash. And then Kip Simpson also posted this link to the US Embassy in Ethiopia, where it's got the warning itself. Now, this was posted March 8th. I believe the crash occurred on the 10th or the 11th. This says the US Embassy is aware of calls for a protest to be held on Sunday, March 10th at Meshkal Square. It's unknown whether the protest has been or will be approved by Ethiopian authorities, but it is avoiding people, or rather it is alerting people to monitor local media for updates, to avoid crowds, be aware of the surroundings, and to keep a low profile. I do believe it specifically temporarily prohibits people from traveling. It tells people to be careful of Bole International Airport. Now, is that the airport where this Ethiopian Air plane crash occurred in Addis Ababa?
That might be the name of the airport. I think Addis Ababa is the capital city, isn't it, of Ethiopia?
I think it is. Let's see. Yes, 157 crash near Bole International Airport. So that's a remarkable coincidence for the U.S. Embassy to be warning people. And you know, David, it reminds me very much of this Israeli text messaging company. There are so many people that live by this mantra of Israel did 9/11. And while I agree, there were components of Israeli Mossad involved in executing and very probably even planning 9/11, and other Israelis that seem to be connected, I find this statement, Israel did 9/11, it's like saying America killed JFK. Even if we're able to prove beyond a doubt that the CIA did it, does that mean that America did it? Does that mean that every citizen in America did it? I think that mantra is used to build hatred toward Israel and Jews in general. So I want to be very specific. I would also add, David, that if one person knew about this plan, they could alert the embassy and say, hey, such and such is going to happen. One person could send a message to this Israeli text messaging company and say, hey, something's going to happen at the World Trade Center. And that gets spun by fake news mongers into, oh, obviously all of Israel knew about this because one message was sent to alert whatever. The point I'm getting at is injecting fake news into the media, field is relatively easy, isn't it?
Well,
David?
that's exactly what they call it the UK Cabinet Office, right?
Wait, we lost you there,
They can do
David.
a variety
Sorry, David, can you hear me? You're breaking up quite a lot.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so let me start again. Injecting fake news is very easy. That seems to be what David Swigert and all of his fake friends who are using Sock Puppet, YouTube, and other accounts are trying to do. Inject fake news to throw people off from what we're exploring.
Yeah, and the premier fake news or media play injector in the world is this British company, SERCO, that provides command control computers and communications and intelligence services to Boeing as the preferred supplier. Ooh. And at Hawkills in the United Kingdom, it provides the United Kingdom Ministry of Defense with various levels of resilience training, including using the government's networks, communications networks, and injecting a media play or fake news, and then interviewing with trained TV journalists and so on, the senior government officials as they respond to some ad hoc emergency that's created. So on 9/11, SERCO was probably in the world the leading player in terms of fake news injection. It's the world's largest non-state air traffic controller. It's run the air traffic control towers in Baghdad and in Dubai, well, in Dubai for the last 50 years. It runs the United States Patent and Trademark Office. It runs the United States National Visa Center. So SERCO would have been in a position to bring in Al-Qaeda sleeper cells and position them in, let's say, protege companies working with Boeing and Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman, and using the encryption that was invented by Lockheed Martin and a patent applied for, I think, in March of 1997, 4 months after little John Benet Ramsey was tortured to death. In June of 2001, Lockheed Martin transfers or reassigns that bit spreading patent to British Aerospace, which would have put British Aerospace in June of 2001 in a position where it could trigger a catastrophe bond set up by SERCO shareholders with the demolition or the attack on the Twin Towers in New York. Over to you.
And it's interesting to note, David, that so many of these mass casualty events seem to be coupled with some sort of investment play. There's a lot of research done into the shorting of the various airlines and companies involved in 9/11 that was, so much beyond the normal activity of short sales on those stocks that it is just very suggestive that the people doing those transactions would have had foreknowledge. We also explored how shareholders in MGM Entertainment made a lot of money on selling that stock or divesting themselves of that stock prior to the October 1st, 2017 shooting in Las Vegas. We've spoken about the catastrophe bond that was taken out by PG&E prior to the Paradise, California fires. It just seems like it cannot be a coincidence that these mass casualty events occur in coordination with these huge financial plays, complex financial crimes that are difficult to figure out. I also want to point out, David, on SERCO's own webpage, they have this June 7th, 2011 press release where SERCO receives the Supplier of the Year award from Boeing. And it's interesting that on such a sophisticated website, they've got this HTML error here where the quote marks are appearing instead of as quote marks, but ampersand, QUOT, semicolon. So there's some sort of error here with this press release. But obviously, SERCO is a provider of professional technology and management services to the federal government and has been recognized as Supplier of the Year by the Boeing company. It's strange to me, David, how these corporations are tied into government services. We've spoken a lot about the military-industrial complex, and of course, if a government outsources its functions, whether they're day-to-day bureaucratic functions or military functions or cybersecurity functions, if they outsource as a government those functions to a corporation, doesn't it mean that an enemy of that government needs to only take over the corporation, something that can be done with a stock transaction rather than going to war with a government?
Well, totally. So that you've got shareholders of SERCO meeting on the 47th floor, including the government of Saudi Arabia, which is supposed to be suspect number one.
Well, but doesn't it also mean, David, that manipulation of the federal bridge would be a key to world domination?
Yeah, totally. And let me would you mind just going to my reverse CSI scripts? Because up on the left, I'd just like to talk about the logo and what I believe to be a remedy, because the public, we the people, you, the good teachers and students are up against, what J. Edgar Hoover said, a conspiracy so monstrous they cannot believe it exists. And what JFK, I think, suspected when he talked about a secret society, and I think threatened to expose it, and that resulted in his death sentence. But if you go up to the reverse CSI website,
we're there
on the left. Yes, if I could just mention about why I've designed that logo as I have and the little blurb beside it. So I've got students, teachers, ground truth CSI. The bad teachers, the sociopathic teachers that want to overthrow the government of the United States, there's a tiny number of them. And I think it might be very well described by the words a small foreign faction,
right,
on the ransom note of John Benet Ramsey. That is to say, the teachers that come into the United States, they go to their illustrious universities and less illustrious, they get onto faculty. Didn't Einstein teach at Stanford, I forget which. So there's a lot of foreign teachers that are coming into the country, and they get onto faculty and they preach whatever it is turns their crank, if you will. And of course, there are domestic teachers like Bernardine Dawn and Bill Ayers who are totally unambiguous. They wanted to overthrow the government of the United States by force, right? They're killers, sociopaths. They should be behind bars. They should quite conceivably be on death row. They get this elite position as on faculty of the University of Illinois and Chicago, and they preach their venom to students, right? The young students, they come along and they're immediately told, merely by breathing out, you're a threat to the survival of the planet. So you have to be ready to off yourself, or whatever, because carbon dioxide is such a toxic gas. The only remedy, I think, for that ability to project propaganda, news, and entertainment on these extraordinarily powerful networks is every student group in a university or post-secondary education facility or college should have access to the same kind of virtual reality theater as the teachers use to propagate their propaganda. And so I've got that kind of, it's actually, I don't know if you picked up on that, Jason, it's a pair of binoculars where one arm of the binocular has been spun round to look up, and the other arm of the binocular has been spun round to look down. And I've got these two avatars, AI Hawk. My background is in artificial intelligence, so it's a kind of play on the avatar. David Hawkins is an expert in artificial intelligence, and Truthman is an individual, an avatar who can go into a crime scene, preferably into a virtual reality theater, and look at an empirical bit of evidence. Like in the case of 911, it might be what appears to be a bright white flash as the first weapons platform hits the north face of the North Tower, as captured on the no-day camera. And I believe that's a proximity fuse supplied by British Aerospace, which is meant to trigger explosions inside the building and kill everyone right in the vicinity of that explosion, because you don't want anyone to appear as a witness on what really happened on 911. Or it might be an empirical bit of evidence like the hole in the Pentagon, in the inner courtyard, where it's impossible for a Boeing thin-skinned aluminum aircraft to penetrate through 8 walls and create a hole like that. That would be consistent with a Lockheed rocket-boosted hardened penetrator bomb. Yeah. So the idea of the logo is that we should be looking, or students should be looking down into the conspirators' minds, if you will, and try and ground-proof it, but understand they're looking up at us, right? So Swigart and his cronies are basically looking at us as we look into the crime scene, and they're constantly trying to adjust where we go through decoys and diversions and all that sort of thing, so we don't get too close to the original conspiracy that I believe was a hack of the United States main defense contractors and an attempt to overthrow the government by force on 911. Over to you.
Yeah. Now, David, we've got, I believe it was Teleprime who asked this question, who's watching us on YouTube, asking if Bernardine Dohrn was on faculty at University of Illinois at Chicago. What I'm finding here is that Bernardine Dohrn, let's see, just real quickly if I can find this. She received, where was it here? Maybe it's in education. She got her law degree at university. She received a JD from the University of Chicago Law School in 1967. And so that might explain how she was hired at Sidley Austin, where she came to mentor Barack Obama. And certainly we know that David Sweigart's brother, George Webb Swigart, is a huge Barack Obama fan, has said many times that he is always going to defend Obama. I personally think Obama was a despicable criminal, although I voted for him. I didn't know that at the time, and what I've learned about him since then has changed my opinion of Barack Obama. I do not think he was a good president. I do not think he showed us a legitimate copy of his birth certificate. But whoa, look at this. Bernardine Dohrn attended Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. That's the same college that George Webb went to. I didn't know that until this second. But the connections are quite interesting. David Swigart has told us many times that he's worked in litigation support. So that would be something that would have him in close contact with law firms. He's been super aggressive in spewing out idiotic lawsuits that have no basis in fact or law and are busily being smacked down by right-minded judges around the country, while Swigart shops around his ridiculous fiction in the hopes that it will somehow stop Crowdsource the Truth from progressing, speaking with people like yourself, people like Charles Ortel, interviewing Mike Moore, Larry Klayman, Laura Loomer, all the people that I bring onto the show. So it's extremely important, David, that people watching us recognize when they're being lied to by the Sweigerts, and if they enjoy our broadcasts, they've got to become sponsors of the show. It's very difficult for you and I to carry on what we're doing, focus all our time and attention. Certainly we're broadcasting, you and I, twice a week on Wednesdays and Fridays. And on Fridays, of course, people can see the show by going to patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth and patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards, as well as subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. So it's interesting to observe the weak and foolish techniques Mr. Zweigert attempts to use to distract people from the really pertinent questions that you and I are raising here each week. What do you think about this information about Bernadine Dorn going to the same college as Sweigert's brother and getting a law degree from University of Chicago?
Well, I'm always wary of sort of crimes by association, so yeah, those two people meet. What I'm more intrigued by is what role she had at the university, Northwestern University, which is in children's law. And let me just go back to SERCO. SERCO provides a service of demon face recognition to track pedophiles in the United Kingdom. And that often results in the arrest of pedophiles, or the alleged arrest of pedophiles, around the world. And it's kind of scary when you think that SERCO is the preferred supplier of command and control equipment to Boeing, and Boeing's 737 MAX 8s have been crashed in a similar way, like a double occurrence. That Boeing, SERCO runs the United States Patent and Trademark Office, the National Visa Center, FAA contract towers. So you've got actually an organization that is capable of monitoring movements on what I call the Con Air pedophile piloted pimping network, of the kind that appears to have taken Bill Clinton to the island that's now burnt down. I mean, how an island gets burnt down, it fails me. And also, through being the world's largest non-state air traffic controller, take these planes through maneuvers that ultimately result in a very satisfactory, from their point of view, saving in carbon dioxide weight, because the plane crashes, all the people on board are dying. And remember that SERCO has been using artificial intelligence algorithms to process its patent applications at the patent office. And in November the 15th, it got to the 4 millionth patent created. Means it's got a pool in de facto custody, so it can go into that pool. Anything I can do in my head, but that's something I believe we need a virtual these universities to help the students understand that, and I'm very happy to mentor them. They can assemble a set of patents. Let's think of some useful patents for 911. Well, how about the Lemelson prisoner tracking patent that uses AI algorithms to reward prisoners or parolees for doing what they've been asked to do? Well, on 911, maybe it's to put together a false flag attack. There's another Lemelson patent, friend or foe swapping, right? Well, that would be quite useful if you wanted to take out the Pentagon and you swap the signals being transmitted from the weapons platform heading towards Captain Gerald DeConto, the duty officer. So the missile battery on the roof of the Pentagon would interpret the incoming weapons platform as friend. Well, actually, that's what happened. Captain Gerald DeConto got on the blower to talk to Gordon England, the Secretary of the Navy, and asked him for permission to override the software controls that were preventing the launch of the missiles. So this idea of getting inside these networks as a hacker, and the ability let me think of two more patents. There is the bit spreading patent that would allow you to inject telemetry controls into the weapons platform of the 2 MAX 8 aircraft that crashed, and the weapons platform that hit the Pentagon. And the beauty of that is it doesn't have any latency problems. So if you're placing bets on the time of death of the victims in the Twin Towers or on those planes, you can be accurate to the nearest millisecond, because every byte of information has got a header with the precise timing on it, and it's the perfect method of communicating between the people actually guiding the weapons platform or demolishing the MAX 8 plane. So those three patterns alone, in the custody of SERCO or its shareholders, would allow you to execute the attack of 911 as a double occurrence cat bond fraud, and the attacks on the Boeing MAX 8 aircraft, which effectively could be a cat bond fraud, because they could be placing their money on two of those MAX 8 aircraft coming down within 5 months of each other. Over to you.
Oh, that's a good point. So, David, there's so many connections, and the people who are chatting with us right now on YouTube and Periscope and the other platforms are raising a lot of these questions. We've got Peter telling us that CBC showed numerous pictures of single shoes when describing the crash site. That touches on things that Ole Damagard has observed in his research. I mean, I stress again, I think that Mr. Swigert and his misguided cronies are busily trying to spread lies about myself, this network, the guests that I have on the show, because they don't want the power of crowdsource investigative journalism to be applied to these crimes. They seem to be very dedicated to covering up, spoliating evidence, if you will. One of Mr. Swigert's favorite pastimes, spoliating any evidence that might connect these things together that would give the average person, concerned citizen, or even professional investigators the puzzle pieces that they would need to put these things together. Of course, everybody remembers when I spoke to Wilbur Ross, he wanted to talk about space. He didn't want to talk about SERCO. And so obviously we weren't able to get any additional information from him. I also spoke, of course, with Alan Dershowitz. So when we speak about the Jeffrey Epstein Island burning down, well, there we've got someone who, according to his own statements, has firsthand experience going to that island. And, you know, I think it was just yesterday that they announced, David, that they're going to be unsealing the documents from this Jeffrey Epstein, I think it was a civil matter where he was sort of suing the victims who had alleged sexual misconduct. Mr. Dershowitz said that he hoped that these emails would come out, and now it would appear they will be coming out. So maybe he's getting what he's hoping for, or maybe, as some people have speculated, he was just posturing there outside the courthouse, saying these things to make it appear that he is innocent. That would qualify as fake news if he were doing that. But we don't know. You and I are exploring these possibilities. We're exploring these connections. And it seems that the people who are surrounded, or I should say surrounding Mr. Swigert, just keep coming up with fake nonsense to throw at you and I, making up stories, making up things that we've never said, trying to associate us with people that we're not associated with, trying to blame the actions of others on us. They're just lying, which is quite strange. I think they should just go away. They've got a lot of time to spend on this, but I don't know, David, we need to keep looking into these Boeing 737 MAX 8 crashes and all of the seemingly coincidental factors surrounding them. What do you think?
Well, totally. And potentially, you see, this is incredibly serious, because if, whether through accident or design, someone like Swigert opens up a link between EADS, the European Union, and Airbus into the Federal Bridge, such that they could hack into Boeing aircraft and cause those crashes, as appears to have been the case on 911 when 4 planes went through these odd decoy and drone maneuvers, designed apparently by McDonnell Detweiler, now called Maxar Technologies. Because if there is a link between the European Union, Airbus, and Sidley Austin, the law firm that employed Bernardine Dawn and
Barack and Michelle
Hussein
Obama.
Yeah, Barack and Michelle Obama. You know, it's so close to an act of war, it's not funny. Because you've got then a case of economic sabotage where Boeing, I don't say it can be brought to its knees, but pending a very difficult investigation into what appears to be, for me as an expert in this area, artificial intelligence programming of that maneuverability software system on the MAX 8, then the logical extension is to start thinking about grounding all Boeing aircraft because it's not paying attention. Now, I think Boeing is a target here.
Oh,
I think
yeah.
there'll be lawsuits against Boeing, for civil damages. But if Swigart and his cronies have hacked in through accidental design into, let's say, a top-off exercise staged by Booz Allen and Hamilton, where I think I sent you a document about from page 7, where it talks about the national response plan assembled apparently by Booz Allen and Hamilton, where it looks for popular and mass casualty events.
Top
So
off
you've
and mass
actually an
casualty
organization
events?
that puts together this.
We're losing you a bit, David. Can you hear me?
Yeah, right. So you guys putting population control and mass casualty events. Did you get that?
Yes.
Okay. Well, how does a sovereign state like the United States defend itself against a simulated continuity of government exercise that is simulating population control and mass casualty events, and a switch which can happen within seconds or microseconds or milliseconds to a live fire event? I don't think the United States can protect itself because it doesn't understand how its major networks have been compromised by a group of sociopathic teachers, including Bill Ayers, Bernardine Dawn, the Clintons, and the Obamas. Over to you.
Well, let me pose a hypothetical question to you, David, because again, we're not accusing these companies or even these individuals of doing this, but hypothetically speaking, if a hostile foreign entity, even if that was a single wealthy investor, wanted to wage war on the United States, I think we all pretty much acknowledge that we're sort of in Cold War 2.0 right now, whether it's Donald Trump versus the deep state or however we want to categorize it. There is sort of a cyber war going on. And I've archived recordings of David Swigart planning cyber warfare games, etc., and preparing a cyber militia. So let's presume for a moment some nefarious individual might hire Mr. Swigart as an ethical hacker. They could deceive Swigart. They could tell him they're looking for vulnerabilities in any of these military industrial contractors who he has all these clearances and his experience in the Air Force that would allow him to work on clandestine, or what was it, classified networks. He would be the ideal person to do resilience testing of the networks of any of these, and unbeknownst to him, he might be opening a link between various entities on here. Veterans Affairs, for instance. David Swigart is frequently boasting about a lawsuit he brought against the CIA in 1994 and 1995, but the records for this lawsuit are not available on Pacer, I guess because it's over 20 years ago that it occurred, but what I'm able to see about it is that it was dismissed. Because like the lawsuits he's engaged in right now, it was probably filled with nonsense. But the wife of the lawyer who defended the CIA works for Veterans Affairs. Could Swigart have been up to some nefarious activity as an ethical hacker with the Federal Bridge back at that time? When was the Federal Bridge being developed, David?
Oh, well, it's got an amazing pedigree. Public key infrastructure was invented at GCHQ, I believe, in the late 60s and 70s. And it was so important, it was never announced as a public release. And I believe GCHQ secretly and covertly began working with the National Security Agency in the States during the 70s and 80s. So by the time the 1980s came around, in a primitive form, I don't know how extensive it was ready to be used, I think, for secret communications between consenting adults, so to speak. And I actually date the original use of the public key infrastructure to the bombing attack on Pan Am 103,
Wow.
which was in 1988, right? Now, that was the time, really interesting. What had previously been called RCAGB 1929, Radio Corporation of America 1929 in Great Britain, was the target for a management buyout. And then it became an initial public offering, and Serco took on this amazing array of institutional shareholders, including the Teachers' Pension Fund, and the government of Saudi Arabia, and the government of the United Kingdom, and the government of Singapore. But I believe the bank that handled that initial public offering was N.M. Rothschild and Sons Limited, and that would have been 1988 and 1989, when Trump was getting into serious debt, right? And he needed his debts rolled over, otherwise he was going to be pushed into bankruptcy. So Trump turned to Wilbur Ross to restructure his debts. And, you know, the borrower is always the servant of the lender. So around 1990, Wilbur Ross and N.M. Rothschild managed to roll over Trump's debts with what I believe are called collateralized debt obligations. And they basically said to Donald Trump, right, well, we'll forgive you these debts, but you're going to have to pay us back later. Now, deep in the heart of Illinois and New York, you've got this young, upstanding metrosexual character called Barack Hussein Obama, who is, and most Americans don't understand that, it appears he's an expert in leverage leases and currency swaps, right? So in the 1990s, after failing to bring down the towers in 1993, with that guy who ended up in one of Christine Mass's jails at ADX Florence, besides subsequently Timothy McVeigh, who she had executed, and the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski, right? They failed to bring the towers down in 1993, and actually Trump had a tour of the basement where the bomb went off.
Yeah, and he said there must have been bombs.
Must have been explosives inside the building.
Yeah.
Right. So in 1993, they decide, well, we'll next time we're going to bring them down.
Yeah.
So a lot more planning went into bringing them down. But I think the first cat bond was written, I think, by Hanover Trust in 1994. I'm sure that Sidley Austin glommed onto that, because there's an opportunity for making serious money. That is to say, if you can trigger the cat, so to speak, you get the investors' money. And the dumb investors' money is this $1 trillion teachers' pension fund. So it's an extraordinary story where, in one sense, you have to forget the complexity of the networks and look at the characters of the principals. And I think those six, I would argue, and I don't know if they'll want to come after me for libel, those six teachers are sociopaths. Bill and Hillary Clinton, Barack and Michelle Obama, and Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dawn. And why aren't Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dawn on death row? Because there's no statute of limitations for murder. Over to you.
Yeah, it's really, really crazy. Well, David, we've exceeded our hour for today, but it's always fascinating for us to speak. Just to preempt the next stupid video that Mr. Swigert is undoubtedly going to create, I just wanted to reiterate that according to Wikipedia, which can obviously be manipulated, at least someone believes that the idea of public key cryptography was first presented by Martin Hellman and Ralph Merkle and Whitfield Diffel at Stanford University in 1976. I think it's also worth mentioning that GCHQ was, the existence of it was first revealed, where is that? It wasn't revealed until 1976. So this is Duncan Campbell and Mark Hosenball revealed the existence of GCHQ in an article for Time Out. So it's interesting to note, it's certainly possible that if GCHQ did develop public-private key infrastructure in the Federal Bridge, in 1976, when they were revealed, they might be motivated to inject some fake news and tell people, oh, no, we didn't invent this. Somebody at Stanford invented it. So, you know, it's interesting to see how these various bits of information get spread out. You and I are questioning them, of course. And I want to thank you, David, for joining me again today. It's always a fascinating conversation. I hope that people watching now will become sponsors of the show to help us keep doing what we're doing. It's very important that people sponsor both David by going to patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards and Crowdsource the Truth as well by going to patreon.com/crowdsource the truth or to subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth. And of course, people can read more about David's research and his ongoing investigations into these types of things by going to reversecsiscripts.com. That's David's new website. It's totally free, and people can explore that to their heart's content. David, thank you very much for another fascinating episode. We'll be back on Friday, and I'll see you then.
Thank you very much, Jason. Oh, my Twitter feed is
Yes.
at CSI Hawkins, and I'd love to have followers. I don't quite understand the how the Twitter works, but I'd love to see a lot of followers because I think we've really got an interesting story.
I agree with you, David, and I'm sorry I should have had that Twitter page up. Twitter is a bit of a mystery. You've got to be sort of a social media expert and able to convey your ideas in short little tweets. Donald Trump has certainly demonstrated you can do quite a lot communicating via Twitter, so people can follow David there. As he said, he is at CSI Hawkins, so please go to Twitter and follow David, and we will be back on Friday, so make sure you join patreon.com/crowdsource the truth and patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards. Once again, thank you, David. Thanks everyone for watching.
Thank you, Jason.